Bethesda is fundamentally incapable of creating a good Fallout game. Let's talk about why. I'd like to preface this by saying that I have zero doubts Fallout 4 will be a runaway mainstream success, selling 25 million plus copies and being an action RPG staple in the years to come. So if you enjoy the shallow sandbox experience, the first featured in Morrowind and perfected in Oblivion, then you'll probably be happy with what Fallout 4 has to offer. I also accept that this is the majority of people, so I'm not under any illusion here that the silent majority is on my side. Also, if you enjoy what Bethesda does, you probably think that the only real criticism that classic Fallout fans have against Bethesda is the change from turn-based isometric gameplay to third-person or first-person action-based real-time gameplay, which is actually more of a byproduct or a symptom of the problems that Bethesda has with Fallout rather than a cause of them. To nip that particular argument in the bud, the reason turn-based combat and an isometric perspective were so beloved by Fallout fans was because they were the mechanisms that best helped to portray Fallout as the PnP campaign simulator in video game form that it was actually designed to be from the very beginning. See, before Fallout became its own distinct franchise, it was supposed to be a post-apocalyptic game based on Steve Jackson's pen and paper rule set GURPS. This game had 5 key tenets, and this is part of what I will focus on when I make statements like, Bethesda will never create a good Fallout game. So we have the 5 rules. The first rule is multiple decisions. We'll always allow for multiple solutions to any obstacle. Rule 2 is no useless skills. The skills we allow you to take will have meaning in the game. Rule 3, dark humor was good, slapstick was not. Rule 4, let the player decide how he wants to play. And finally, Rule 5, your actions have repercussions. After licensing issues prevented the Vault 13 GURPS game from eventuating, we got a homebrew system in its place. That became known as Special. However, these core design goals still permeate just about every aspect of Fallout's design. That's not to say that the original 2 Fallout games were able to nail every one of the tenets 100% of the time. For example, there were optimized builds, with some skills not doing a whole lot over the course of the game, but the idea was that each skill had something it could hang its hat on, even if it wasn't a viable skill to focus on for the whole game. In any case, those 5 tenets together formed a strong framework, and removing key aspects from that framework without considering how it would affect everything else, like Bethesda did, greatly damages the game as a whole. It should also be noted that the cancelled Black Isle Fallout 3 Van Buren project would have featured an adjustable 3D camera and optional real-time combat in the vein of Arcanum anyway, turn-based / real-time, so it's easier to blame nostalgia-driven neckbeards, and that's what the gaming community at large has generally put it down to, but it's not the truth at all. Rather than try and take into consideration what makes Fallout good and design around that, they, meaning Bethesda, try to shoehorn their own features and design principles, even if it directly contradicts central aspects to the Fallout franchise. Now this is why Bethesda is incapable of creating a good Fallout game.
There's only so, if you play Fallout 3, Liam Neeson is the voice of your dad, and there are some good emotional beats there, but there's only so much you can do when you're just clicking on a line of dialogue and there's no spoken response, and you can't. So the emotional depth that we got by having the voice protagonist has just actually way more intense than I even expected.
Well, it is the year 2015. I mean, who reads anymore? Anyway, this speaks to a deeply flawed vision that Bethesda continues to push with their version of Fallout. Specifically, they attempt to build a connection between the player and the game by integrating the player's personal story into the main plot and making it the focus of the experience. In Fallout 3, your connection with your dad, aka a middle-aged guy, was put forth as your primary motivation for completing the game's main story. Now, the likes of the radio jockey 3Dog also emphasise this particular point. 3Dog is a character who, if listened to on the in-game radio, will extol the player's virtues if morally acceptable decisions are made in quests, or do the opposite and condemn you if the player engages in less than scrupulous actions.
I think we've lost this one, folks. Good kid goes bad. It's the story of the wasteland, right? It's a sad, sad day for us all. Kid, if you're listening, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, fuck you, you worthless piece of shit! there not one human being with a shred of decency left in this entire bat-ass-word wasteland? Why? Oh! Faithful listeners, I'm disappointed, and you should be too.
The player character is at the center of the game world and should take center stage in the narrative under this design philosophy. Bethesda sees this as emotional depth, because when the world looks to you to make a decision, presumably, you'd care more about it. Making conversations cinematic and giving the player character a voice is just another way to make the player character a stronger presence in the game world. However, this is in vast contrast to what Fallout has been doing from the very beginning. In Fallout 1 and 2, the player character has a backstory and a story arc, but the protagonist is ultimately used as a window into the world. Fallout is a series about society and human nature, not the player character. The character's personal story arc merely places them in convenient circumstances in which they're able to explore the world around them and see firsthand how their actions affect it. This is different to what Bethesda does in at least one crucial way. The player character in Black Isle's Fallout games is presented as the agent of change, whereas in Bethesda's games, the player character is presented as a literal messiah. Simply put, in Black Isle's Fallout, the protagonist's story arc is important because it gives the player an opportunity to explore the world around you through your interactions. Whereas in Bethesda's Fallout, the protagonist's story arc is important because the world revolves around your character, and progressing with the story allows you to define your character as good or bad. Black Isle's Fallout gives the player many forms of interaction with the game world as a way to become immersed in it. The West Coast is dirty, gritty, violent, and it can showcase the best or worst of humanity, depending on who you run into. You can seduce people, become a porn star with the right stats, become a heavyweight boxing champion, again with the right stats, or a slaver, or help the likes of Myron create addictive drugs. You can say and do all sorts of things if you are role-playing the kind of character who is inclined towards those sorts of activities. And all these actions are optional side content that are structured around your skills and attributes. They tie back into the core mechanics, your character build, and ultimately, your role-playing, rather than being segmented from the rest of the game. These kinds of down-to-earth interactions already weren't part of Fallout 3, but Fallout 4 with its voiced protagonist compounds the issue further. At a guess, the overwhelming majority of voice dialogue would be tone-neutral conversation progression, and since all interactions are cinematic and voiced, there's less room for non-conventional interactions covering controversial subjects. With changes to the skill system, as in dismantling it completely, special dialogue options might be divided by simple morality rather than by build. This links back to Rule 1 mentioned above. By offering less ways to interact and navigate through dialogue situations, you are offering the player less and less ways to overcome obstacles and challenges in the game. While the game is set in an open world per se, the quest design becomes more linear, and the end result is an experience where the player doesn't feel as connected to the player character. This is because the player character can no longer express themselves through any real nuance that relates to their skill sets or non-binary morality. Now, this isn't that much of an issue if the game is filled with really well-written dialogue sequences that allows the player to express a complex range of emotions, motivations, and skill sets. However, this is Bethesda we're talking about.
Why don't we ask the newcomer? You support the news?
Yes, Bethesda really cares about emotional depth for their protagonist's dialogue. Please, tell me more. One of the things we really try to avoid is surprising the player with whether they've been good or bad. We want it to be clear to you that you're making a conscious decision to be one or the other. I've played games where I made a choice and I thought I was being the nice guy, and then it's, wait, why is he upset? We didn't want it to be a surprise. Sometimes it's a surprise in terms of how a person reacts if you're being a jerk, but it's not a surprise as to whether you're good or bad. So, in addition to dialogue, the lack of character depth for the protagonist becomes all the more apparent when you look at the karma system from Fallout 3. Karma from Fallout 1 and 2 are minor systems that can be summed up as a moral reputation. They have specific titles for levels of karma and consequences that relate mostly to interactions with potential companions. But as a whole, they're not very relevant. Unless you cross certain lines like killing children, the Wasteland in general isn't going to care about your morality. Why would the people of the Den or the gangsters of New Reno care if you've eaten your vegetables and been a good boy? The people in the game care about the tangibles, and it's this dilemma that provides much of the fodder for the moral quandaries you'll face if you wish to play as a virtuous or selfless character. The role of morality in a post-apocalyptic wasteland that's so far removed from what we are familiar with is absolutely central to how the Fallout games are put together, because Fallout deals with how society rebuilds from the brink of destruction. It asks, how do we rebuild in a way that this will never happen again? As such, many of the situations you encounter are coloured in shades of grey as opposed to being strict black and white. Power struggles by forces in a conflict of ideology instead of clearly defined good and evil. And granted, the original 2 Fallout games had plenty of situations where you choose between an arsehole and a non-arsehole, as well as featuring many broadly good versus evil decision points, but in the ending slides, and this is important, no significant consideration is given to your morality. The games don't assume your motivations and then judge you for them. It just lets you navigate the setting and push the changes you want onto the game world through your choices. Your character is defined by your personal moral code, your narrative choices, your skill set, and your physical attributes. That's why moral dilemmas are a staple of Fallout games. You see, it's a series that's predicated on challenging the player to see if it's possible to change the human nature that got the world to this point, and to show the player the results of their choices and their morality. After all, war never changes.
The general idea is that we have the 3 major factions, Mr. House, NCR, and Caesar's Legion, but then there are all these sub-factions like the Great Khans, the Powder Gangs, the Kings, the Boomers, the Followers of the Apocalypse, and the player can go to those groups and try to shift alliances.
We want the player to experience those factions. We want them to know what politics are at stake and what ideologies these organizations represent.
So when they choose what factions they want to work with, it's based on something more than just a gut, they're good, they're evil reaction.
Bethesda's Fallout, however, turns this concept on its head. Just about every action you are able to undertake is given a moral value through the karma system, and through characters like Three Dog and your father, the game constantly reminds you of your character's morality. Your decisions throughout the game are neatly categorized into good and evil. This is also reinforced through the endings. Unlike the other Fallout games, where huge variance is given based on your decisions in each of the locales, often with overlap or cascading effects, the Fallout 3 endings emphasize the player's morality in each of their decisions. The effect you had on society is secondary to whether the PC has been categorized as naughty or nice. By forcing the player into strict moral guidelines that the game hammers in at every opportune moment, the player loses a real connection with the world that they're exploring. It harms any potential nuance that the game could display when it comes to morality and characters. Everything is either good or bad, and this absolutely destroys the protagonist as a well-rounded character because they're ultimately defined by what the game can allow you to do. I mean, in other Fallouts you can define your character by your skill set, which informs your playstyle, as well as your narrative choices, but in Bethesda's Fallout, your range of potential actions to define yourself is much more limited. Your interaction with the skill system for role-playing purposes is much more narrow, because it can't fit into the mold of good or evil. The range of actions you can take in the game are boiled down to, I am doing something that is good, and I am doing something that is bad. You are shoehorned into certain character archetypes that are shallow in nature, and the game works so hard to define your experience using those archetypes and nothing else.
The capital wasteland proved a cruel, inhospitable place, but the lone wanderer refused to surrender to the vices that had claimed so many others. The values passed on from father to child, selflessness, compassion, honor, guided this noble soul through countless trials and triumphs. The capital wasteland proved a cruel, inhospitable place, and the lone wanderer ultimately surrendered to the vices that had claimed so many others. Selfishness, greed, cruelty. These were the values that guided a lost soul through countless trials and triumphs. The capital wasteland proved a cruel, inhospitable place.
I have no strong feelings one way or the other.
You know, I think it's what makes games great, is that you can take your own... You're like the director of your experience, and the fact that you can make it your own and the world ultimately becomes the main character of our games. And so I think in a lot of stuff we do, we want to show you that world, and then you immediately think, what would I do in that circumstance? And who would I want to be? And that makes it much more personal to you, and much more of a different experience than other games, other types of entertainment. And at the end of the day, it's what we would want to do the most as players as well. So we sort of in the office say, like, the more we can say yes to the player, the better we are.
Bethesda have long stated that a major goal in their games is that the player should be able to go anywhere and do anything. This central tenet of their design philosophy is at the core of why Bethesda's Fallout is so obsessed with the player character and obsessed with moralizing him or her. The player is at the center of the experience, and the player should be in control of their own destiny. As an idea, this isn't necessarily bad. In fact, it fits nicely with Rule 4 of the Fallout design tenets, which is let the player play how they want to play. However, Rule 4 and 5, Rule 5 being your actions have repercussions, have to work in concert for a proper role-playing experience. You should offer the player freedom, but you need to have consequences for their actions too. The problem is that Bethesda chooses to ignore Rule 5 as part of the design philosophy they've carried over from Elder Scrolls. Nothing should overpower the player. The player should be able to do anything they want. We've seen this manifest in the Elder Scrolls games already in the form of things like quest compasses, zero barriers to guild progression, and level scaling. It seems somewhat obvious and perhaps even pointless to say this, but Bethesda games are designed to be a sandbox, to be played and toyed with at will. The settlement building features being advertised as optional content for Fallout 4 seems to support this idea even more. Modular features over an interconnected, reactive role-playing experience. Nobody wants their RPGs as a choiceless linear experience. The problem is that player freedom and player agency require proper context. The rule set, the game mechanics, and the laws of the setting for internal consistency have to take precedent. Role-playing needs to be structured around those things, otherwise you end up playing pretend instead of actually role-playing. Now, the difference between role-playing and playing pretend is whether the game acknowledges what you do within the confines of the rule set and acts accordingly. But it's that reactivity and design which Bethesda has been actively fighting against since Oblivion, because the Bethesda mindset, the shallow sandbox experience, is against inconveniencing players with things like internally consistent game logic or mutually exclusive content. They encourage the player to just play pretend in their head and call it role-playing. What happens in the end, though, is the game where the player is more of a tourist than an actual part of the universe, and the internal rules and logic of the setting are more like suggestions. And if the game can't respect itself as a work of fiction and abide by its own rules, then why should the player respect it as a work of fiction? Without the strong foundation of enforced internal consistency to a reasonable extent, and mutually exclusive or reactive content, whatever choices and freedom you have are actually hollow in practice. And since that is what Bethesda bases their whole games on, then it stands to reason that Bethesda are in fact creating hollow worlds that are only surface deep, because they are worlds that don't respect your choices to a necessary level, and they require the player to find meaning and depth of their own accord. And that's not to say that there isn't a ton of shit to do in Bethesda games. The amount of content in Bethesda games is often staggering, I won't deny that, but that is breadth, not depth. Bethesda games simply aren't deep, they're quite shallow in fact. For many this is a positive, and look, that's fine. It's key to Bethesda's success and wide appeal, but it's better to call a spade and admit you like spades than to be deluded into thinking that Bethesda games are deep. Now, by having a sanitized game world that gates off risk from players and insulates them from the challenges that the setting provides, for the sake of gameplay convenience, Bethesda shows explicitly that they do not care about the core tenets of Fallout. By designing an easily navigable and sterile environment that poses few risks for the player, they can also close off ways in which developers are able to reinforce narrative tones or themes through difficulty and gameplay situations. Something as simple as the glow from Fallout 1 would not exist in Bethesda's Fallout. Unless the player has the right build and items, it's completely impossible to fully explore the entire location before dying. The player in most cases has to sacrifice blind exploration and focus on what their goals are, constantly going out of their way to manage their radiation levels. Limiting the player using the game mechanics like that is complete anathema to Bethesda's shallow sandbox design. However, by doing so, Black Isle's designers were able to hammer home the idea of the Glow as a literal treasure trove of the old world. It makes you want to explore it. The risk and reward at play makes the player more invested in the location and its story than any kind of cinematic or high fidelity texture. Violence is funny. Let's all just own up to it. Violence done well is fucking hilarious. It's like Itchy and Scratchy or Jackass. Now that's funny. Now, if I'm being honest, I can't exactly disagree with that, but as funny as childish violence might be, the humour of the Fallout setting is mostly grounded in irony and juxtaposition as a means of telling the player a chilling message about the society that they are exploring. Now, this goes back to one of Fallout's central themes: war never changes. Many people, including Bethesda themselves, have taken that phrase to mean that history repeats itself. However, the main takeaway from the phrase isn't about history repeating itself, it's about why history repeats itself. War never changes because people never change. The opening and closing statement of Fallout is an indictment on human nature and informs the player that Fallout is a dark and cynical setting.
When you are all alone, maybe the one who is waiting.
It's that cynicism that drives Fallout's dark humour. It's why Fallout has a clean retro's 50s future aesthetic, one that evokes optimism and harkens the player back to a golden era on the surface, yet juxtaposes that with the terrible atrocity and violence of its broken up and messed up world. It's a big statement to the player that humanity is a tainted species and that no one can escape the violence, selfishness, and barbarism of human nature. The player character in each of the Fallout games exists to challenge that idea and to break it or confirm it based on their actions.
If war doesn't change, men must change, and so must their symbols. Even if it is nothing at all. Know what you follow, courier, just as I followed you to the end. Whatever your symbol, carry it on your back and wear it proudly when you stand at Hoover Dam.
Bethesda's Fallout fails to understand this central theme of the series and how the use of humour is important in building it. Their idea of humour lies in using the juxtaposition as a means of displaying absurdity. Think of the Superhuman Gambit, where a former mechanic and cheesy comic book villain in an ant costume fight over a town for no real reason other than Bethesda exclaiming, "Ha! Off the wall humour, we know Fallout." Sure, the people in said town are pretty sick of it too, demonstrating that they're at least somewhat self-aware, but it's just stupid. To be fair, Fallout 2 shows off a lot of absurd humour as well, and it's actually fucking awful at times, but what makes Fallout 3 different is that its humour isn't baked into the setting with some sort of in-universe logic or purpose. I unashamedly hate the hubologists and she in Fallout 2, and in Fallout 2, just like real life, perhaps it's not such a bad idea if we nuke San Francisco.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
Fucking A.
But like the Kings in New Vegas, at least there's some sort of purpose or tie-in for it. On the other hand, Fallout 3's ridiculousness is just plain stupid. I mean, can anyone explain what kind of functioning adult would be okay with Little Lamplight and Big Town in a supposedly serious and dark piece of fiction? Beyond that, Fallout 3's humour isn't necessary or even a positive addition to the narrative or themes. They don't serve any dramatic, thematic, or comedic effect through the use of contrast. Think about the Republic of Dave or Dukov's Party House or whatever. They don't really serve a purpose outside of, random humour. This causes issues because a lot of Fallout 3's locales are centred around such absurdities, meaning that in effect what you have is a disjointed game world with self-contained communities that are nothing more than cheap disposable jokes that say and add nothing to the greater narrative or themes of the game. I mean, I don't even have to go into further detail as to why it's just bad world building and why Bethesda fails at Rule 3, which is dark humour, not slapstick humour. It's quite terrible design, and no one should defend it. There are no regional dialects, no sense of unified culture or society, and that's really the problem, isn't it? The capital wasteland is a mess. You've got all these little isolationist factions, but there's no unification, no centralized government. As you play the game and listen to President Eden's speeches on the Enclave radio station, you quickly realize that that's sort of his platform. When and if he shows up in the capital wasteland, he'll make everything right again. He'll make America great again. He'll return America to the land of the free and home of the brave, replete with white picket fences and apple pies. The main story arcs for the main series of Fallout games, except for 3 and possibly 4 funnily enough, all deal specifically with society. The problem of survival in the wasteland is central, and the largest factions that vie for power over the course of the series all claim to have the answer to that problem. Fallout 1 has the unity, in which the Master saw the future of humankind in forced evolution, super mutants being best equipped to deal with the world today.
The unity will bring about the master race. Master! One able to survive, or even thrive in the wasteland. As long as there are differences, we will tear ourselves apart fighting each other. We need one race. Race! One goal. Goal! One people to move forward to our destiny.
On the other hand, Fallout 2's Enclave operated very differently, seeing themselves as the legitimate successors of the old world. They found their answer in the total extinction of what they considered to be mutants. The Brotherhood of Steel, meanwhile, saw the dangers that people could do to the world if potent technology was in the wrong hands, so they decided to dedicate themselves to preserving the technology instead. The New California Republic saw the answer in old world American democratic values, that it was possible to create a new America from the ashes of the old. Caesar's Legion also found their answer in old world values as well, but looked to the ancient Roman Empire as their solution. A totalitarian, monolithic culture sustained through conquest and slavery. And in one way or another, you tackle these factions and agree or reject the answer that is presented to you from them. But many of the side quests follow the same vein of thinking. There are towns, villages, and settlements at a fracture point, often because of the greater conflict, but not always. And the player character is in a position to influence the direction of the area. The player can side with leaders and characters that they most empathize with or agree with ideologically, or maybe one NPC will offer you money to kill their rival and you take them up on it. That works too. But these locales and these situations don't exist in a vacuum, and your actions in one area with one character could impact how you deal with others, and that reinforces the idea that Fallout is about society first and foremost. Unfortunately, Fallout 3 and Bethesda's design mentality in general ensures that there is almost zero cohesion between the pockets of civilization and the small settlements that populate the map. Many of the settlements in Fallout 3 are given some sort of theme to distinguish themselves from one another. This is essentially what can be described as a theme park design. The player, acting as a tourist, can visit these themed, segmented, segregated locations and interact or spectate the events happening at their leisure before leaving without consequence.
And then we have various cities. So one of the first ones you run into is Megaton, which is built out of a downed airliner. And so, there are a number of cities in the game. Rivet City is probably the biggest one. It's built inside a beached aircraft carrier on the outskirts of the city. So we really got into making sure every time you got to a location where people were, that they were all living in kind of a unique way. Like, you're very interested in how these people are actually surviving in a world like this.
Outside of Megaton and Rivet City, like Emil and Todd say, there really is no sense of society in Fallout 3. There's no thematic or narrative cohesion that connects all the locations to a greater whole, because the quest arcs and endings for each location stay strictly self-contained if they feature in the ending at all. Then it's clear that Bethesda did not understand the idea that Fallout is about rebuilding society. This also speaks to Rule 5, your actions will have repercussions. By ensuring that almost all of the locales are wholly self-contained, they allow the players to act inconsistently, doing good acts in one place and doing evil acts in another. The simplistic karma system balances things out, and the game doesn't really react to what you actually do. thereby exposing Bethesda's approach to morality and their understanding of it as hollow and shallow. An extreme example of this would be to blow up Megaton and then donate water to the homeless beggars endlessly until your karma is positive once more, which enables you to access the heroic ending slides. I mean, it's a farce, really. And on a personal note, as for another reason why I think Fallout 3's main story is bad and doesn't tackle the core themes of Fallout, and I quote here, "In areas of heavy fallout, about 99% of radioactivity in water could be removed by filtering it through ordinary earth." So all that fuss about the water purifier. Fallout 3's story is equivalent to dirt in the most literal way imaginable. I could go on with instances of Bethesda retconning prior lore, as well as documenting the simple, basic failures of logic contained within the game itself. I could blather on about the awfully written lines, the mediocre gameplay, the non-existent difficulty curve, and the bugs upon bugs upon bugs. I could talk about the advertised features of Fallout 4, and why creating your own settlement without significant story integration into the main narrative is something that pushes Fallout further away from the tight, cohesive open world to a shallow sandbox. But the purpose of this isn't to show why Fallout 3 was a shit game, and why Fallout 4 will be the same. The goal of this video and the essay accompanying it is to demonstrate how Bethesda has shown fundamental failings and misunderstandings at what makes the Fallout setting tick. The 5 rules that were established since before Fallout became Fallout have driven to the design of the entire main series, and none of these are rules that Bethesda truly pays any attention to. In addition, by ignoring the key themes and core literary devices that Black Isle's Fallout uses to drive home its message, like challenging gameplay situations and good level design, and allowing the player to properly roleplay instead of just playing pretend. By not doing those things, Bethesda has demonstrated that they will never get a Fallout game right. The only reasonable conclusion is that Bethesda's Fallout is shallow and meaningless. They create objectively bad Fallout games. If you like the changes Bethesda has made gameplay and graphics wise, that's fine, that's great. But if you're a fan of Fallout, then look beyond the superficialities. It doesn't really matter if a Fallout game is turn-based and isometric, or if it's an FPS action game. The undeniable fact at the end of the day is that Bethesda is fundamentally incapable of creating a good Fallout game. Look, Fallout 4 will be a very successful game, and there's nothing I could ever do to change that, but I hope this reaches the hearts and minds of gamers far and wide, opening them to the idea of looking at Bethesda games in a new light and viewing them with a more critical eye. I'm fairly confident that this video has expressed a deeply unpopular opinion, but if you're watching this video, then I hope I've made a compelling argument and possibly changed your opinion on the matter as well. Most of all, if you've gotten this far into the video right to the end, then thanks for watching. Thank you very much.